We are, at long last, in a position to erect the argument for the resurrection of Jesus. I would formulate the argument as follows. 1. There is testimony saying that Jesus was resurrected. 2. This testimony comes from credible sources. 3. There are only 3 logical possibilities with respect to credible testimony. It is true, it is deliberately false, or it is honestly mistaken. 4. The credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not deliberately false. 5. The credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not honestly mistaken. 6. Therefore, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true. 7. If the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true, then Jesus was resurrected. 8. Therefore, Jesus was resurrected. Premise 1 is, or at least should be, the least controversial premise within this argument. Surely no one doubts that the 4 Gospels do claim that Jesus rose from the dead, regardless of how they judge the truth of that claim. Premise 3 should also be fairly uncontroversial. After all, there are only 2 possibilities when it comes to the truth of any proposition. It is either true or false, and if it is false, then it can only be either intentionally false or unintentionally false. Hence the 3rd premise expresses a true trichotomy. Premise 7 is a tautology, and is, therefore, true by definition, and premises 6 and 8 follow deductively from the preceding premises. Hence, the controversial premises are going to be premises 2, 4, and 5. Arguably, premise 2 is the most controversial premise within the entire argument. It asserts that the testimony pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus in the 4 Gospels is credible. By credible here, I mean that the sources of information originate with someone who is in a good position to know if some event happened, such as an eyewitness. The importance of this premise is that it disallows the skeptic from positing that the Gospels represent the end of a long-evolving legendary oral tradition. If the Gospels come directly from eyewitnesses, or their immediate followers, then this forces the skeptic into the trilemma stated in the 3rd premise. As Brant Pitre puts it, contrary to what some claim, 2 of the Gospels that report Jesus' appearances after the resurrection claim to be first-hand eyewitness testimony. The Gospel of Matthew records Jesus' appearance to the 11 disciples, which would of course include Matthew himself. And the Gospel of John records the appearance of Jesus to John the beloved disciple, along with several other apostles, while fishing in the Sea of Galilee. And that is to say nothing of the accounts contained in the Gospel of Luke, who describes the material in his Gospel as also being based on the testimony of eyewitnesses from the beginning, though he does not name them. Of course, none of this means that you have to accept the truth of the accounts of Jesus' appearances. What it does mean is that there is no historical basis for claiming that there are no eyewitness accounts of the appearances of the risen Jesus. You can reject those accounts if you'd like, but you can't say that they don't exist. And Lydia McGrew adds, the Gospels undeniably present themselves as true accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, without any need for a highly specific genre identification. One can say that the immediate impression one gets is that the evangelists intend to tell what really happened. I say that this is probably the most controversial premise within the argument because the overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars believe that the Gospels are late and anonymous, and certainly were not authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, strictly speaking, the defender of this argument does not have to defend the traditional authorship of the 4 Gospels if he can come up with another way to show that the Gospels go back to credible witnesses. And various defenders of this general line of argument have thought of various ways to do this. However, the most straightforward approach to defending the second premise, and the approach that I prefer, is to simply show that premise 2 is true by demonstrating that the Gospels were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew explain, if we take the account indicated by the external evidence at face value, we shall be essentially forced to concede 2 points. 1. The first 2 Gospels were written very early, well before AD 70, and 2. They came either directly, Matthew, or one removed, Mark, reporting what Peter had said, from independent eyewitnesses who had been Christ's own disciples. Fortunately, I have already made the case for traditional authorship at length in a previous video, so we need not dig into the details here. For those who are skeptical of the second premise of this argument, I invite them to consider the detailed case I offered in that video. But for the purposes of this video, I will take premise 2 to be defended. The next portion of this video, then, will primarily be concerned with defending premises 4 and 5. There is, perhaps, a different sort of objection which might be raised against the second premise, which it will be worth briefly addressing. The skeptic could object that, wholly aside from the issue of who wrote the Gospels, we could not have credible testimony pertaining to the resurrection of Jesus for the simple reason that no one would have been in a position to know that it happened, even if it did. In other words, the resurrection, if it actually occurred, was not directly witnessed by anyone. Now, this observation, that no one witnessed the resurrection event, is certainly true as far as it goes. Surely no one other than Jesus himself was inside the tomb for the actual event. Nevertheless, it does not follow from this that no one was in a position to know that Jesus rose from the dead. A person could perfectly well be in a position to know that Jesus rose from the dead simply by 1, knowing that Jesus was dead at one time, and then 2, knowing that Jesus was alive at a later time. These 2 items of knowledge together allow one to know that Jesus rose from the dead. So if one can know these 2 things, then they can be in a position to know that Jesus rose from the dead, even if they didn't directly witness the event of the resurrection. As Stephen T. Davis puts it, it is frequently pointed out that there were no witnesses in the tomb at the crucial moment, and that, therefore, the resurrection itself was not observed. This is surely correct. Some go on to argue, however, that the resurrection was accordingly unobservable, that in principle it could not be observed by human beings, and that this is what rules out the possibility of Jesus' resurrection being an event in history. I only wish to point out 2 logical fallacies that are sometimes committed here. 1. The inference from the fact that the moment of the resurrection inside the tomb was not humanly observed to the conclusion that it could not have been humanly observed, and 2. The inference from the claim that the resurrection could not have been observed, if this is granted, to the conclusion that it is therefore not history. So given that this objection does not succeed, and given that I have already defended premise 2 in excruciating detail in a previous video, I am going to take premise 2 for granted. If premise 2 is true, then the skeptic is forced into the trilemma stated in premise 3. All I need to do for the remainder of this video, then, is to show that the testimony pertaining to Jesus' resurrection is neither deliberately false nor honestly mistaken. If those possibilities can be ruled out or shown to be sufficiently unlikely, then this will allow us to conclude that the testimony is true, and this, in turn, will entail that the resurrection actually occurred. Against the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were deliberately lying, 2 points can be made. First, it seems that they had nothing to gain by lying about this. There is no obvious benefit to be gained by deliberately misleading people into believing that Jesus had been resurrected. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew put it, the prior probability of such a conspiracy in the specific context is not very high. it is hard to see what motive the disciples could have had for planning a conspiracy to convince others that Jesus had risen from the dead. Even before their own warnings from the Sanhedrin, after they began teaching that Jesus was risen and spreading the message of forgiveness through his name, they knew full well that such preaching was unlikely to gain them societal power, not counting the possibility of influence in a small and well-hated new sect, sexual gratification, wealth, or anything else of value to unscrupulous men, but rather persecution and death. Second, there appears to be every reason not to lie about something like this. The early Christians faced intense persecution at the hands of the Romans. Generally speaking, one of the strongest human instincts is self-preservation. If the disciples really believed that Jesus was resurrected, and that this ensured them eternal life, then their willingness to die for this belief is easy to explain. On the other hand, if they were deliberately lying, it is very hard to explain their willingness to die. On balance, the evidence is strongly opposed to the idea that the witnesses to the resurrection were liars. Again, the McGrews observe, beginning on the day of Pentecost, the now 12 apostles engaged in behavior that virtually invited martyrdom, persisting in asserting that Jesus was risen in the face of known danger and explicit and escalating threats. Now, there has been a recent series of criticisms objecting to the idea that any of the apostles actually did die as martyrs, or that early Christians faced significant persecution. The most well-known critic here is Candida Moss in her book, The Myth of Persecution. However, we need not get bogged down here, since I have already addressed Moss and other skeptics in considerable detail on this point in a previous video. Hence, skeptics of this premise are referred to that video for an extensive defense of the persecution and martyrdom of the apostles against the leading critics. Suffice it for now to say that the persecution of the early Christians is well attested in Acts, the Gospels, the writings of Paul, the writings of the early church, and even in Roman sources like Tacitus and Suetonius. Now, it is common for counter-apologists to respond to this point about persecution and martyrdom by insisting that people can indeed die for lies. A favorite example here is radical Islamic suicide bombers, who likewise demonstrate a willingness to die for their faith. But clearly that doesn't make Islam true. Now, I think that this is a good response to the careless but unfortunately often repeated claim by Christian apologists that no one would ever die for a lie. Plainly, that is not true, but I would make 2 points by way of response. In the first place, while it is easy to find examples of people who unwittingly die for a lie, it is considerably more difficult to find examples of people who willingly and knowingly die for a lie. In the case of the apostles, we are talking about people who are in a position to know whether or not what they are saying is a lie. Since they were the source with which the belief in Jesus' resurrection originated, they would surely know whether or not they were lying. And in this respect, they are different than suicide bombers who are not in a comparable position to know the truth or falsity of their religious beliefs. Second, notice that my argument for the resurrection does not conclude that the resurrection really happened just because the apostles wouldn't die for a lie. Premise 3 explicitly leaves open the possibility of the apostles being honestly mistaken, even if they weren't lying. I am using persecution and martyrdom in support of the fourth premise, which merely rules out the apostles lying about the resurrection. They were sincere. In cases like that of suicide bombers, which are supposed to be a counterexample to this claim, actually support it. Suicide bombers presumably are willing to die for their causes because they sincerely believe in them. It's just that they are honestly mistaken. And the same point applies to the apostles. It could be that they were honestly mistaken about the resurrection. Premise 4 does not deny this. Premise 4 merely asserts that they were not lying. and their willingness to die for this belief is absolutely evidence for the truth of this premise. Licona makes this point quite well, saying, "The disciples' willingness to suffer and die for their beliefs indicates that they certainly regarded those beliefs as true. The case is strong that they did not willfully lie about the appearances of the risen Jesus. Liars make poor martyrs. No one questions the sincerity of the Muslim terrorist who blows himself up in a public place, or the Buddhist monk who burns himself alive as a political protest. Extreme acts do not validate the truth of their beliefs, but their willingness to die indicates that they are sincerely convinced of the truth of their beliefs. Moreover, there is an important difference between the martyred apostles and those who die for their beliefs today. Modern martyrs act solely out of their trust in beliefs passed along to them by others. The apostles died for holding to their own testimony that they had personally seen the risen Jesus. Contemporary martyrs die for what they believe to be true. The disciples of Jesus suffered and were willing to die for what they knew to be either true or false." The fifth premise in my argument says that the apostles' testimony attesting to the resurrection is not honestly mistaken. Unlike premise 4, defending this premise is a more complicated matter. This is because there are so many different ways in which a skeptic might suggest that the apostles were honestly mistaken. If they were not lying, then perhaps they were honestly mistaken as a result of purely psychological factors such as expectation, hallucination, groupthink, cognitive dissonance, or grief. Against the thesis that the disciples were honestly mistaken on purely psychological grounds, there is already an immediate difficulty, namely the empty tomb. To the extent that we are going to posit that the disciples were honestly mistaken, then we must accept that they at least genuinely believed their own reports contained in the Gospels. This means that we would have to accept their witness to the fact that Jesus' tomb was really empty. This physical evidence cannot be explained by a purely psychological hypothesis. As Jake O'Connell says, if the tomb was not empty, the Christians could not have believed Jesus was raised from the dead. Now, there are several ways in which the apostles might have been honestly mistaken about the empty tomb. These would include the ideas that the apostles went to the wrong tomb, or that Jesus' body had been stolen, or reburied by a third party. These hypotheses are insufficient in and of themselves to explain the resurrection appearances and subsequent belief in the resurrection, but they can be paired with psychological explanations to account for all of the relevant evidence. The difficulty is that neither of these explanations is independently particularly plausible. That absolutely everyone should have been mistaken about the location of the tomb, strange credulity, and that some third party would want to steal the body doesn't appear particularly likely, especially if we believe Matthew's account that guards were present at the tomb. I understand that most skeptics will wish to reject the guards as a later apologetic, but this becomes a challenge to premise 2, which asserts the credibility of the testimony pertaining to Jesus' resurrection, and I have already defended this premise. In the present context, we are assessing challenges to the apostolic witness on the assumption that it is honestly mistaken. So if Matthew is honestly mistaken about the resurrection, and he is attempting to tell us the truth, then the presence of guards at the tomb cannot be explained away as being an apologetic invention. The main point here is just that the two major ways in which a skeptic might account for the empty tomb are already highly unlikely, and this unlikelihood will be compounded when paired with a psychological explanation to account for the apostles' experiences of the risen Jesus and their subsequent belief in his bodily resurrection. So now we turn to the major ways in which one might account for the appearances of the risen Jesus in the Gospels without thereby invoking the resurrection itself. While skeptics have appealed to various factors, such as cognitive dissonance and groupthink, it's important to realize that these are only explanations for how the apostles might have come to believe in the resurrection. They do not account for the apostles' experiences of the risen Jesus as contained in the Gospels. One can believe in something without an experience of it, and one can experience something without believing in it. Experience and belief, therefore, are different, and alternative explanations for how the disciples may have come to believe in the resurrection will not automatically explain how they could have come to experience the resurrected Jesus. Far and away, the best option open to the skeptic here is to suggest that these experiences of the risen Jesus were grief hallucinations. But there are numerous well-known difficulties here. Probably the most important is that Jesus appears to groups of people within the Gospels. Hallucinations, much like dreams, are private to the individuals who have them and cannot be shared between or among different people. Andrew Loke puts the basic worry this way. A hallucination is understood in the present context as involving a sensory experience which occurs in the absence of corresponding external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ. It is unreasonable to think that a group of people perceived the same thing together at the same time when there is nothing there extramentally corresponding to their experiences. For without a corresponding external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ, the mental states internal to each person within the group would not agree on various details concerning their experience of the external world. Skeptics will sometimes suggest that there have been such things as group hallucinations, but it's important to realize that in these cases, we are not literally dealing with different people seeing the exact same thing or having the exact same visual experience. What we are dealing with is groups of people who are all having individual but similar hallucinations. As Jake O'Connell explains, the hypothesis which we mean to designate by the term collective hallucinations is the hypothesis that people may, while in each other's presence, have very similar individual hallucinations, and that the hallucinations may be so similar that the precipitants may afterward believe they have seen the same thing. The hallucination is not transferred from one person's mind to another's. Each has his own hallucination in his own mind. Of course, the odds of two people just happening to have very similar hallucinations at the same time are astronomical. Can this account for the resurrection appearances in the Gospels? It seems unlikely, since they involve Jesus doing very specific things, like helping the disciples fish, eating with them, or inviting Thomas to touch him. Even if the apostles had group hallucinations of Jesus, it seems unlikely that they would all see him doing these exact things. Furthermore, most actual examples of so-called group hallucinations are actually cases of visual illusions rather than hallucinations. Again, Loke says, cases which have been labeled as group hallucinations may have been cases of illusions, which is a case of misidentification. A recent study by Bergerson and Habermas concludes that collective hallucinations are not found in peer-reviewed medical literature. Moreover, the experiences of the risen Jesus were multisensory. They didn't just involve seeing Jesus. They also involved hearing him, talking to him, eating with him, and touching him. While it is possible to have auditory hallucinations, and probably even some sort of tactile or gustatory hallucinations, that is, hallucinations involving feeling or tasting what isn't there, these sorts of hallucinations are much rarer than visual hallucinations, and the odds against them all coalescing around all of these individuals in exactly the same way are just astronomical. As Andrew Loke and Nick Meader observe, one of the difficulties for the hallucination hypothesis is that multiple Gospels attest that the disciples touched Jesus. If these were hallucinations, they would be exceptions to the rule. For example, Rees found that 2.7% of widows claimed that their dead spouse had touched them. Similarly, Grimby found 6% of spouses experienced tactile hallucinations. Although some studies report slightly higher rates, such as Olson at 13%, median estimates across studies show tactile hallucinations are far less likely than other sensory modalities. Timothy and Lydia McGrew add, a third factor exacerbates this problem. The hallucinations would have to be not only parallel, but also integrated. According to the Gospels, the risen Jesus interacted with his disciples in numerous ways, including eating food they gave him and cooking fish for them. In such contexts, the disciples were interacting not only with Jesus, but with one another, physically and verbally. The suggestion that their parallel polymodal hallucinations were seamlessly integrated is simply a non-starter, an event so improbable in natural terms that it would itself very nearly demand a supernatural explanation. What's more, group hallucinations typically occur among individuals who have some level of expectation or have been primed to have them. While one could argue that Jesus' predictions of his own resurrection caused such an expectation, in fact, the evidence within the Gospels suggests that the apostles expected nothing of the sort. The depictions of them there show them to be despondent and afraid that they will be killed next. What's more, even after Jesus appears to them, many are still said to doubt in Matthew 28:17. And then there is doubting Thomas, someone who most surely was not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead, and who refused to do so until he could physically touch Jesus' wounds. The depictions of the apostles within the Gospels don't portray them as being particularly susceptible to group hallucinations at the time at which their experiences of the risen Jesus occurred. As Loke says, given that hallucinations are caused incrementally, expectation is evidently a relevant factor. One issue is whether all the eyewitnesses already had prior belief that Jesus would rise from the dead. The historical evidence indicates otherwise. The resurrection appearances occurred to Paul and James, both of whom were unbelievers. Moreover, even among the 12, there were those who were initially doubtful. And then we might ask why these group hallucinations occurred abruptly 3 days after the crucifixion, conveniently coinciding with the discovery of the empty tomb, and then ended abruptly 40 days later. This is not typical of bereavement hallucinations, nor of group hallucinations. As Gary Habermas asks, why did the hallucination stop after just 40 days? I understand that skeptics will want to say that these depictions of the apostles may be later and legendary, or that the idea that the appearances ended abruptly after 40 days is legendary. But that returns us to a discussion of objections to premise 2. In the context of defending premise 5, we are assessing the plausibility of the idea that the testimony which the Gospels relay about the resurrection appearances can be honestly mistaken. And from what we know about the nature of hallucinations, even group hallucinations, the resurrection appearances of Jesus in the Gospels do not appear to fit the bill. A further difficulty with the appeal to hallucinations, which has not been appreciated by most skeptics, or even by most apologists, is that the writers of the New Testament demonstrate a clear ability to delineate between veridical experiences and visions. The biblical authors have no problem saying that God spoke to people through visions, yet they don't include the resurrection appearances in this category. Were the disciples to have had hallucinations, they would have much more likely been like visions and interpreted as such. But their experiences of the risen Jesus don't appear to have been like that. As Loke points out, the New Testament authors consistently refer to resurrection appearances as involving an extramental appearing in the real objective world. They distinguish this understanding of resurrection appearance from that of a vision, a term which they refer for subjective mental phenomenon. Now recall that the implausibility of hallucinations as an explanation is going to be exacerbated by the implausibility of the explanations for the empty tomb, with which the hallucination theory must be conjoined in order to adequately explain all of the evidence. The result is that the most promising way to say that the apostles were honestly mistaken is highly improbable right out of the gate. As Craig reminds us, the hallucination hypothesis seeks to account only for part of the evidence, namely the appearances, but it does nothing to account for the empty tomb. In order to explain the empty tomb, one must come up with another theory and join it with the hallucination hypothesis. And Habermas and Licona add, combinations of theories generally lead to higher improbability, not a more probable solution. If a combination theory is to be true, all of its subtheories must be true. If one is not, then the theory fails to account adequately for all of the data. If one subtheory fails, the combination fails. Of course, there are other means of trying to explain how the disciples might have had a sincere but mistaken belief in Jesus' resurrection. These range from mass hysteria to cognitive dissonance. Stephen H. Smith and Herman Philippe are examples of recent champions of these sorts of explanations. However, like the hallucination hypothesis itself, these psychological explanations are typically employed merely to explain the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection. Skeptics rarely, if ever, think that these sorts of explanations for the disciples' belief can also explain how the resurrection appearances, as described in the Gospels, could be honestly mistaken reports from the eyewitnesses themselves. As Aron Lucas, a skeptic himself, puts it, if the disciples really did have extended, detailed, integrated, polymodal sightings of Jesus, in which they all ate and lived together, then of course these appearances cannot be explained by something like a hallucination. But as far as I know, no advocate of the hallucination theory has ever seriously suggested that the appearances, as described in the Gospels, are explained by hallucinations. Though to advocate a hallucination hypothesis are using hallucinations to explain the minimal facts version of the appearances, not the maximal facts version. Since my resurrection argument is unapologetically a maximalist argument, it has the virtue of being able to bypass most of these psychological explanations for how sincere but false belief in the resurrection might have originated. Hallucinations are deeply implausible, and factors like mass hysteria, mass delusion, and cognitive dissonance lack the explanatory adequacy to explain the sorts of experiences which the gospel resurrection narratives describe. There is one further hypothesis by which the skeptic could try to explain both the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances without combining hypotheses, without appealing to any psychological phenomenon, and without affirming the reality of the resurrection. This idea, commonly known as the swoon theory, asserts that Jesus never actually died on the cross. He only fainted or swooned on the cross, and was then buried alive. Later, the coolness of the tomb revived him, and when his disciples saw him alive, they mistakenly believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. This hypothesis has few defenders these days, due to the sheer number of implausible things which it implies. However, some Muslim apologists do defend it, since the Quran plausibly commits them to it. So for the sake of completeness, it will be worth briefly reviewing the problems with this idea. Right off the bat, it's incredibly difficult to take seriously the suggestion that Jesus did not really die on the cross. Crucifixion was an absolutely brutal form of execution, and there is only one individual known to have survived. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that after the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans in AD 70, the Roman commander Titus had numerous Jews crucified. 3 of these were friends of Josephus. Upon his request, Titus had these 3 individuals removed from their crosses, and they were immediately given medical attention. Even having undergone only a partial crucifixion, and having been given immediate medical attention, 2 of these men died anyway. Thus it is unthinkable that Jesus, who had undergone a full crucifixion, and then was given no medical attention whatsoever for 3 days, should have survived. As Gary Habermas explains, in spite of being given Rome's very best medical care available, only one of Josephus's friends survived, even their shortened crucifixion. The other 2 died under the physician's hands. The point here is that besides this single case of a rescued crucifixion victim, we know of no other survivors of crucifixion in antiquity. But if general considerations aren't enough, recall that John tells us that a spear was used to make sure that Jesus was dead prior to his removal from the cross. What exactly should be made of John's statement that both blood and water poured from his side is unclear, but this at least potentially indicates a ruptured heart, which would remove all doubt about Jesus' death. And as Habermas points out, ancient sources report that occasionally a final stroke to crucifixion victims guaranteed their deaths. The spear wound to Jesus' side is an example, with medical opinion concluding that the weapon punctured his heart, ensuring his death. Also, if Jesus had been alive and the spear had pierced his pleural cavity, an obvious sucking sound would have alerted his executioners. And if it is difficult to believe that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, it is even more difficult to believe that if he hadn't, those who buried him wouldn't have noticed. But by far, the biggest weakness in the swoon theory pertains to how Jesus, even if he had survived, should have been able to unwrap himself from the inside, push aside the stone in front of the tomb all by himself with nail-pierced hands, get past the guards unnoticed, walk to wherever his disciples were hiding on nail-pierced feet, and then somehow manage to convince them that he was the risen Lord of life. That this story is utterly unbelievable is the chief reason why almost no one takes this theory seriously. The only exception here would be a handful of Muslim apologists, and their reason for doing so derives from their other religious commitments rather than the independent plausibility of the swoon theory. While David Strauss's comments on this theory have probably been overused by apologists, they remain effective nonetheless. It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression that lay at the bottom of their future ministry. Perhaps the skeptic will agree that none of the explanations for how the apostles might have been honestly mistaken is very probable. However, the improbability of these scenarios is simply dwarfed by the improbability of a miraculous event. So no matter how unlikely or contrived these explanations may seem, they remain better than positing a miracle. As Larry Shapiro says, although what we learn through testimony might suffice to justify some beliefs, when the belief is about something as improbable as a miracle, it faces an especially hard burden. Not an impossible burden, but a burden that, in the case of the miracles reported so far, has not been met. If testimony is to justify your belief in an extremely improbable event, you need very good evidence that there's no better explanation for the testimony. I have addressed arguments of this sort at length in my video defending the rationality of belief in miracles. There I showed why David Hume's version of this objection fails, and so do modern iterations thereof. Skeptics wishing to object on these grounds are referred to that video. But for the time being, suffice it to say that there is no good argument for assigning an infinitesimally small prior probability to the occurrence of a miracle. If a miracle explains a body of evidence far more easily than the most promising naturalistic hypotheses, then there is no reason whatsoever to refrain from inferring a miracle as the best explanation. Some skeptics might suggest more extravagant naturalistic explanations to account for Jesus rising from the dead. Perhaps aliens did it with unknown technology, or perhaps people do very rarely come back to life naturalistically, or perhaps there is some other unknown but naturalistic explanation. In this way, we can account for Jesus rising from the dead without thereby inferring that a miracle has occurred. Again, Larry Shapiro suggests such a move, saying, "I'm simply granting for now that Jesus really did die and then rose to life again. Into the hypothesis box goes God. But why stop with just this one hypothesis? Perhaps 17 gods work together to bring Jesus back to life. Or maybe a nearly omnipotent being, not quite as powerful as the Christian God, but darn close, brought Jesus back from the dead. Could aliens have restored Jesus' life? That's no worse a hypothesis than God. We might also consider the possibility that, on very rare occasions, very, very rare, dead people simply come back to life as the result of natural causes. Why is God the best candidate and not 17 gods, or aliens, or unknown natural causes? Similarly, Raphael Laddister suggests Jesus could have risen naturally by some unknown biological mechanism. After all, we do not yet have a complete understanding of the laws of nature. Jesus may have risen naturally through the intervention of some sympathetic and non-divine alien. Jesus might have possessed a rare or even unique mutated gene which gives rise to resurrections or apparent resurrections. In other words, the hypothesis that Jesus was resurrected fails to answer the so what question concerning God's existence. For the purposes of this video, I am actually willing to grant Shapiro's and Laddister's point. This video is not necessarily arguing that Jesus rising from the dead was a miraculous event. It is more narrowly focused on justifying the proposition that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. Whether or not this event qualifies as a miracle requires further argumentation. I think that this case can be made rather easily, and it is significant that there is not, so far as I know, any non-Christian who actually believes that Jesus rose from the dead naturalistically. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew observe, the resurrection is also positively relevant to Christianity. On any construal of Christianity worth the name, the assertion that Jesus rose bodily and miraculously from the dead is one of its core assertions. It is fairly easy to see that the probability that Christianity is true is greater given that the resurrection of Jesus occurred than it is otherwise on our present background evidence. And Andrew Loke adds, Jesus predicted that his violent and imminent death would be followed shortly afterward by God's vindication of him via resurrection. The occurrence of Jesus' coming back to life 3 days after his death by crucifixion, together with this context, demands an explanation. It is contrived to think that this event, out of billions of deaths which have occurred, happened as a scientific anomaly and is associated by chance with a person's claim to be divine and or with the person's prediction of it. But since in this video I am solely trying to show that Jesus did rise from the dead, and these sorts of appeals to unknown naturalistic explanations tacitly assume that Jesus did rise, these sorts of explanations from Shapiro and Laddister are not actually in conflict with the basic thesis of this video. They are simply offering an alternative explanation for how Jesus rose from the dead, rather than a rival theory which would suggest that Jesus did not rise from the dead. We can now confidently say that there is abundant reason to believe that the testimony bearing on the resurrection of Jesus is neither deliberately false nor honestly mistaken. As noted in premise 3, there are only 3 logical possibilities when it comes to credible testimony. It is either deliberately false, honestly mistaken, or it is true. And if those first 2 options have been eliminated, then that leaves us with the third, namely that the testimony declaring the reality of Jesus' resurrection is true. And this means that the resurrection really occurred.